So here we are on Mission Point, so called because this was the mission for the Jesuits to Hudson Bay, Fort Colville, which was down over that bank from there. But all around here for 9,000 years is where the natives would dry salmon that they harvested out of Kettle Falls, which is just over the bank in that direction. They would get 1,700 50-pound Chinook a day. So they had big buildings that they constructed out of split cedar, which would be an important part of the Columbia boat we'll talk about later, and one of the inspirations for the people that actually built the boat. But there's a cemetery over here for natives and a lot of other little features that you don't see, but I consider it the most important place in eastern Washington historically because of that 9,000 year history of the fishery and the fact that because of the congruence of all the natives coming here to fish and doing so peaceably for thousands of years, a tradition that was carried on by Hudson Bay Fort Colville when it got here to take advantage of the fish and of all of the natives being in one place already. So I'm Joe Barreca. I'm the president of the Heritage Network, an association of museums and historical societies in Northeast Washington. And we're here to talk about the bicentennial of the establishment of Hudson Bay Fort Colville. So we're standing in front of this monument to Hudson Bay Fort Colville, which was established in 1825. Really, they didn't get it built till 1826, which is the date they have down here. These names down here are important. George Simpson, the head of the Hudson Bay Company, is the one who determined that this would be the best place for this fort, and he had the Spokane House people move from down in Spokane 100 miles away up here to be next to this giant fishery that the natives already had going on. John Work was the guy that he assigned to do that movement, and he had a lot of trouble because the people that were down there at Spokane House didn't really want to move, and they didn't really build it very quickly. They have down here Archibald McDonald and Angus McDonald, two of the most important fur traders that were at this fort, and they were very instrumental in keeping the natives safe in a time when the U.S. military and gold miners and settlers were all doing things to harm the natives. But natives were really important to the fur trade, and so Angus McDonald, who was married to a native wife and preferred to live out in the teepee during the summer, was very protective of them. So the Historical Society put this up in 32. Down here is another add-on where it talks about the beginning of farming, milling, and stock raising in the county, and that's really true. The fort was not just a fur trading place, it was a fishery. It was a place where they raised a lot of food that they delivered to all kinds of places along the Columbia River, and they built boats here, and they had a big mill that would grind the flours from the grains that they grew at the fort. The fort was actually over this hill here, which is now a big empty bay. Fort Colville was constructed, or begun to be constructed, in 1825. It was 20 years later that the first Catholic priest, Father Rivaldi, came by, and it was 2 years later that they had built the first one of these hand-hewn log churches. Later, Father Desmet and Father Josette were important in that they traveled all over the inland Northwest and were trying to negotiate peace between the Protestants and the settlers and the military and the gold miners and the Indians that were very upset by what was happening there. They weren't entirely successful, but they did prevent, I think, even more damage happening than did during the Indian Wars of 1858. Okay, yeah, I wanted to talk about this building because it is a reconstruction of the original St. Paul's mission, and it's using piece-on-piece construction, which was developed over hundreds of years in primitive conditions with the express idea of keeping the building intact even when it wasn't occupied. So if you look closely at it, even with this shutter here, it's all put together with pegs and then wrought iron hinges and tug and groove with more pegs down there up on blocks underneath. And the idea is to minimize the amount of iron that is incorporated into the building, because iron attracts moisture in the winter, and moisture would make the wood start to rot. But by doing this kind of construction, they were able to just come here once or twice a year with the missionaries and hold their services, and the building would stay intact. So it'll have split cedar shingles up on the top, and if you were inside, you can see these really long beams that are holding it together inside. So it's wood that you can't really find here anymore. So a lot of parts of this building are significant in their own right, just as a kind of architecture. Right, so these shutters are a really good example of wood that's pieced together with dowels. So you're not going to get the effect of anything rotting. It's held together with these wrought iron hooks so that you can just swing that into place and close the whole structure from the inside with one simple motion, which I'm not going to do right now because we don't want this closed. But those beams that I was talking about are pretty impressive if you can see deep in there. We're talking 30 feet or more of single beams without any knots, all hewn by hand out of these logs that, when they were building it, probably the logs were floated down the river. So this is a good spot for a lot of things to come together besides the fish, in that the logs would hang up on the rocks around the falls. Yeah, I wanted to point out this construction that uses these upright posts, and then these cross pieces are designed so that they're notched into grooves inside the post, and they expected them to shrink over time, and so you can see a gap up there at the top. They're designed so that you can put another piece in from the top to keep filling in the wall pieces as they shrink over time. So, and these are all hand hewn. You can see that the marks of the adze on the side of the blocks. They actually did a great job of reconstructing this, probably 1932, around the same time as that monument. People don't realize the work that went into building a building like this back then. All right, so we're here at the sharpening stone. This is the ancient rock from the bottom of the ocean that was pushed up here. And it's a very hard rock, and the natives used it to sharpen their spears. So there's grooves all along here that you can see where for many, many years they sharpened their spears while they were fishing at the Kettle Falls, which is right over here. It looks all calm now, but when the water's drawn down, you can still see there were 3 or 4 different places you could fish depending on the flow of the water at the falls. And so sometimes spearing was the thing to do, other times nets and other things. But this is a very sacred place to the natives. They still hold a ceremony of tears up here where they mourn the loss of the fishery and the Kettle Falls itself. Here on Mission Point, you have Hudson Bay, Fort Colvile up there. And in the spring, or actually at the summer solstice, there's a big canoe journey that starts in Revelstoke and comes all the way down the Columbia River for a week and a half. And the native canoes that are both sturgeon nose and dug out from many different tribes come down and camp out here and gather together. Then they go across to native land that is on the other side of the river where they hold a salmon ceremony. And so sometimes they even race back and forth here. It's a really special spot for the history of the area and of the native people, which came from every direction. The Spokanes to the south, that's Kelly Hill up there, and just over Kelly Hill there were the Pia Mission and some other sacred places for the natives with cemeteries, etc. The whole area right here is a really special place for native people, and it should be for anybody that's interested in the largest cultural impact in Northeast Washington, probably, when the Hudson Bay established their fort and the native people's whole thousands of years of tradition was slowly changed over 40 years into the traditions we have today. This is called, they called it amphibolite, I would call it argillite, but it was the stone that was deposited on the floor of the ocean by magma. And so you can see the layers on the other side as it built up. It would start out as kind of sedimentary, but really it's metamorphic and very, very tough, hard rock now. And so it's like a giant whetstone that the natives would use to get their equipment into place every year for the fishery. Yeah, this rock wasn't in this position when the falls were in operation. They actually brought the rock up here because it was such a special rock when they were getting ready for the dam to flood everything, which is quite the job. It's a hell of a rock. So up here we're looking at Kelly Hill. So to the left of it, the Kettle River goes up and divides Stevens and Ferry County. To the right of it, the Columbia goes up to Juanita and the Canadian border. And in between, sometimes just called the wedge, they have Kelly Hill here. And over the other side of Kelly Hill was the Pia Mission, and it was a winter encampment for a lot of Native people. So it holds a lot of value. There are a lot of stories associated with Able One and the people that live there and would commute over here sometimes to go to mass at the mission, but otherwise for the ceremonies and gatherings that happen here during the fishery. Okay, yeah, I wanted you to be at this spot because it has a good view of this whole big bay in here. This is where Hudson Bay Fort Colvile was. They had over a square mile of land under cultivation. So the fort would have been down here. There was a creek that went around this side, and that's probably where they would have let their boats into the water or taken them out of the water if they were coming from upstream. But Now it's hard to tell that it was a huge enterprise with people coming from all directions and furs being brought in boats being built and crops being grown. And in the spring, they would have 200 horses going north to Canada after the Canadian line was established. So there was a lot that went on here for 70 years until the railroads came in and everything that was Hudson Bay pretty much disappeared. So it stopped at this place because over there you can see a little portion of the Portage Road. It went from the fort over here all the way across past the highway and down several miles really to get around the falls, and there were a lot of rapids below the falls. So all the canoes that the fort built, hundreds of them, were portaged over this road to get down to the lake where they can actually do some good. And there were tons of native canoes that went up and down. In 2011, when it was the 200th anniversary of David Thompson's development of what was called a Thompson canoe at the time, we're calling it a Hudson Bay or Columbia boat. There were lots of canoes that were taken down here and assembled in the bay where the fort used to be and taken across the river for the salmon ceremony and other things. So it's a really historic spot just because it was on the road, so to speak, between the fort and the rest of the river. I'm Joe Barreca, the president of the Heritage Network. Thank you for listening to this documentary, and please help us bring back the boat.